Hello and welcome to Developing a NAMA Deep Screen, the second webinar in the series Developing Financeable NAMAs. My name is Melissa and I'm a project manager with the Climate Change and Energy team at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I will be moderating the session today and we have a distinguished group of presenters. Dave Sawyer is an associate with the International Institute for Sustainable Development here in Ottawa. Marie-Claude Bourgie is a project manager with EcoResource in Montreal, and Deborah Murphy is an associate with IISD joining us from Kenya today. This will be a one-hour webinar. The first half of the webinar will be presentations, followed by 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A. Before I hand things over to Dave Sawyer, our first speaker, I want to provide a few administrative tips. We hope that you will interact with us in this webinar. If you have any questions, they can be typed into the questions section near the bottom of your console at any time during the webinar. Be sure to click on the plus button next to the word questions in order to expand the pane. A box will appear where you can type your questions. During the Q&A session, we will also be addressing questions that have already been posted by participants in the online course forum. Likewise, if you think of questions after the webinar, I encourage you to post them in the course forum. More than 200 people have registered for this webinar, and polls are a great way for everyone to participate. As a warm-up, I'm going to launch a poll now. Please select the region from where you are accessing this webinar. As you can see, the results show that 29% are from Europe, 23% from Asia and Oceania, 20% from Latin America and the Caribbean, and both 14% from North America and Africa. I will now launch another poll, and if you could let us know the sector you represent, that would be helpful. As you can see, 57% from the private sector, 29% from government, and 14% from civil society. So we have an overwhelming majority from the private sector here today. Our first speaker today is Dave Sawyer, an associate with IISD. Dave is an environmental economist with over 20 years of national and international experience. He has built a solid reputation as a leader in the economics of climate policy and energy futures in Canada, and his advice is routinely sought by a wide cross-section of climate policy leaders around the world. His diverse and prolific portfolio includes energy and climate change, air pollutant economics, environmental and natural resource economics, and water and wastewater economics. We're happy to have him with us. Dave, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you, Melissa. Good morning, everyone. Clearly, we have a nice global crowd today with good distribution. This is the second webinar we've hosted. We're going to be hosting 3 webinars in total. The first webinar looked at our quick screen guide, and this one is going to look a little more in-depth at a more full and substantial assessment approach that we have included in our practitioner's guide, which you can find online at iisd.org/climate/developing. Practitioner's guide is there. We're going to also look at the e-learning course. I'm going to talk a bit about that, which basically takes the practitioner's guide and makes it a little more accessible for folks in the self-directed learning exercise. And then we're going to walk through 2 detailed case examples with a focus on Rwanda first, and then a focus, the DRC first, and then a focus on Kenya. So we're going to introduce the framework and the concept, and then we're going to do sort of real-world examples where we sort of sat down with countries and helped them basically develop some NAMAs. So moving forward, a quick overview of the NAMA's practitioner guide. So it's really just a conceptual framework for implementing low-carbon, climate-resilient development under which NAMAs can be prioritized. So the practitioner's guide first sets the context around low-carbon, climate-resilient development, sort of the scenarios approach to the world and sort of the macroeconomy-wide focus, and then starts to look at how NAMAs can be developed within that sort of broader view. And I'll talk a bit more in a second about how you can have a singular focus on a sector or more of an economy-wide view in NAMA's development. The guide is really a step-by-step methodology for screening NAMA opportunities, both within and outside a low-carbon development planning process. And I'll talk a bit about that. But basically, you can have a fully formed NAMA's process underway, And the practitioner's guide can help you pull together and develop additional information to sort of organize it and push it towards an end result or an outcome that is useful for a variety of things. Within the practitioner's guide, we have two streams. The last webinar talked about the quick stream concept, which is basically just identifying in a very sort of quick and easy way a list of opportunities that could be taken forward for prioritization in countries. So we are not doing an analytics that do the prioritization. Prioritization is clearly the purview of the country. The practitioner's guide and indeed any NAMAS process is really about country prioritization. It's not about the analysis informing the political process and the bureaucratic process about prioritization. So the deep screen proposal then takes those concepts and pushes down more analytically into areas that we're going to explore a little more. So the practitioner's guide is three things. One, standardized country-driven process, again, key. Two, simple and easy to follow, either nestled within low-carbon planning process or outside as a separate entity. And we've road tested in a whole series of areas, and we're going to talk today a bit about that road testing. The e-learning course that we've developed on the practitioner's guide is really targeted at practitioners and policymakers in developing countries. We're offering it free of charge under a Creative Commons license. It's online. You can access it. We're going right now through a pilot period, and then we're going to be basically updating the e-learning course as we roll forward, so it'll be a dynamic process. And there are really three modules mirroring the three webinars we've been hosting. One, a quick screen in 2 languages, French and English. 2, a NAMA deep screen, the topic of today. And then next week, we're going to be having preparing a GHG emission baseline projection, which is much more technical and really the foundation of a lot of the work. And of course, we'd like to thank Environment Canada and the International Development Research Centre in Canada for supporting this work through Fast Start funding. We're going to conduct a poll right now, so if you could answer the question, do you have a list of NAMA opportunities identified for your country? Or if you were working in a country with partners, development partners, was there a list of priorities that you could start from? So this is our starting point. Please answer the poll. So here are the results. So there's a whole group not applicable, so perhaps they're not working in developing countries on the issue, or they're not necessarily a country-driven. They're not sitting in a country developing NAMAs. But there's a nice even split almost between, have you identified NAMA opportunities or not. And this is a really interesting outcome because it sort of implies flexibility in how you approach NAMA's development. So this schematic here basically answers or addresses that poll that we just conducted. So there are really two questions at the top. Have you already prioritized NAMAs in your country, so you can see where you start? If the answer is yes, you can almost jump right over to conducting the detailed analysis and doing a deeper screen. The quick screen is really designed, and again we talked about this last week, the quick screen is really designed to help you sort of take a whole series of documents and take basically the common information base and sort it down into a way to find country appropriate NAMA opportunities. It's not about identifying new opportunities, but it's really about identifying opportunities that exist in sort of current plans and priorities. So there's nothing new coming out of there. And we'll talk a bit more about the deep screen today. The validation process, the green bar on the left of your screen, consultation and validation is key. If we've learned anything about NAMA development, they are fundamentally about financing. And whenever you're talking about financing, priorities and interagency issues arise almost immediately. And as sort of as a development partner, it's really hard to understand what the real current, and the underlying priorities are. And so that's why we talk about we bring opportunities forward for validation, but prioritization is absolutely under the purview of the governments and their partners. So sort of sustained presence in country and consultation and validation is absolutely central to success. So the e-learning course, we've taken the practitioner's guide, and you can go online and see this and at our ISD Learning Center. If you go to our homepage right now, you'll see that our Flash player will give you a direct link into our Learning Center. And we're pretty excited about this, about the learning guide we brought forward. So it's a self-directed learning opportunity. There are 7 steps. I won't go into great detail here because we talk about them in a bit, but they mirror exactly the practitioner's guide, starting from general context and all the way down to reporting and validation, and then next steps and supplementary resources. So that's the online course overview. We have some interesting progress tracking features. So there may be certain bits of information or certain elements of the practitioner's guide that you're more interested in, and you can basically walk through the course and identify those areas you're interested in, and then also you can track your progress. So there's a progress bar to see the elements that you've walked through. So it's just sort of when you come back to it, because obviously how you use it when you sit down at one time, you don't have to walk through the whole guide. You can come back and forth to it, and it's set up in a modular fashion, so you can basically track your progress. There's some self-tests with feedback in it, so just to sort of keep you awake and keep you, sort of testing your knowledge. So these are scattered throughout the document. The NAMA deep screen methodology is about catalyzing a process. If you cannot feed into an existing process for prioritization and for NAMA's selection, you're in trouble. NAMAs are fundamentally about financing, and whenever you're financing projects, various interests, whether they're political or otherwise, or departmental or agency, are involved. So you have to really focus on feeding a process and not just doing analytical work that basically doesn't have any entree into the various departments and into a process. Secondly, the NAMA Deep Screen is about developing information that can be used for the NAMA registry, either seeking support for the preparation of a NAMA concept, so sort of initial stages, or much more detailed NAMA proposal development, ultimately moving through the life cycle to NAMA implementation. So this Deep Screen process is taking you from very sort of terse concepts that you have that may be prioritized, and doing the analytical process and informing the stakeholders that here are the implications of these NAMAs, and ultimately we want to validate and finalize a select group of NAMAs that we can move to implementation. We have 7 steps. So we had, first step, identify a list of potential actions that may be given to you or not. Second, develop a reference case. We're going to talk about this next week, but basically you're looking at forecasting emissions out into the future and then reducing or bending down those emissions in time through abatement opportunities and low carbon climate resilient opportunities, including adaptation benefits. 3, there's some quantitative analysis involved. Typically you'd think about this as wedge analysis around mitigation potentials and costs, cook stoves, low emitting electricity options being deployed in time to bend down emissions. Assess associated impacts. NAMAs are about SD benefits, sustainable development benefits first, and development planning and priority first, and then they're about thinking about mitigation and adaptation. So co-benefits in the step 4 are absolutely critical. Yes, ancillary effects, there's all kinds of terms that are being used right now to basically think about how you choose mitigation options that really identify or achieve a whole series of benefits. Next, financing becomes important. We have a Deep Screen report. I'll talk a bit about that next. And then validation and finalization, absolutely critical with stakeholder involvement. So finally, what do you get out of the NAMA's outcomes? Well, we think it catalyzes a domestic process to further NAMA development. So basically there's a lot of learning that has to happen and a lot of sort of prioritization and thinking. Second, it raises political awareness of NAMA and financing potential. So it basically highlights what the upside is, the opportunity. And it develops roadmaps for further NAMA readiness activities. There's not a lot of talk about institutional capacity. With the movement to NAMAs to sector-based analysis and economy-wide analysis and bringing in stakeholders, we think large processes are being developed, and institutions in developing countries, especially LDCs, will be in a bit of a bind as this process rolls out. So there's readiness funding that has to happen. It highlights priority action needing financial support, so it's like a shopping list to transmitting to donors. And finally, you can update your GHG inventory for national communications and other UNFCCC reporting. The process may not develop a perfect national communications inventory, but it certainly pushes you very close to that level of excellence. We talked a bit about this last week. So it's a repetition, but essentially you can take the information from the deep screen, and we've designed it so that you can put it directly into the emerging NAMA registry. So the outputs of the process are mapped directly into the NAMA registry to make sort of reporting in the registry really easy and straightforward. So an e-learning course, have you taken one before? Have you used it as an opportunity to further your skill sets? Wow, so there's a high number of people who have taken e-learning courses. That's a really good number. So clearly there's a demand for e-learning courses. So there's some planned uses for after the pilot project is done. I won't go into great detail here, but we're going to be basically developing the e-learning course in time and viewing it as a dynamic process that we're going to improve and expand and increase modules. Thank you for your time, and we'll be now moving on.
Thanks very much, Dave. Our next speaker is Marie-Claude Bourgie. Marie-Claude is currently working as a climate change and finance consultant for EcoResources Incorporated, a Montreal-based consulting company. Her work primarily focuses on NAMA and climate financing capacity building projects. Marie-Claude has also supported the Congo Basin country negotiators during the climate change negotiations and has been involved in the carbon market for many years. Most of her career involved the private sector and development of CDM projects in Africa. In this context, she worked on the validation and the implementation of afforestation, rural electrification, and alternative energy projects. Marie-Claude, can I pass it over to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Melissa. Good morning, everybody. So what we're going to focus on for this part of the presentation is we took the deep screen methodology and we applied it in the field in the Congo. So I'm going to present to you what the results were. So the first step was the deep screen selection. So some of you were at the webinar last week looking at the steps for the quick screen process. So what we did, we followed these steps and we brought the results from the quick screen in the field, in the DRC, to have a local stakeholder consultation process to narrow it down and to identify NAMAs that were a priority for the country. So it's really important to understand that it is a stakeholder-driven process. So if you look at our approach, it's a bit of a funnel approach where we started with high-level government authorities to really identify what was the priority sector for them in terms of their sustainable development strategy. From there, we went to see stakeholders, the technical side of the government, civil society, and communities to see what were the priority actions within the sector that was identified. Then we narrowed down a bit deeper and we looked at these priority actions and where was the GHG abatement potential and where were the co-benefits potential. Because when you talked about NAMAs, mitigation and co-benefits are really head-to-head. It's important to really address both at the same time. So from there, we're able to select actions that could be potential NAMAs. Then I noticed in the poll that many of you are from the private sector. So what we did, it's really important to be able to finance these NAMAs. So what we did is that we went and consulted the private sector to see what was interesting for them and what was financeable in terms of these selected actions. And from there, we went even a step further and we consulted project developers, NGOs, development agencies to see what was feasible on the ground, because you can have many good ideas, but given some barriers and some risk, what is exactly feasible in the area we're looking at. And ideally, if you follow this methodology, you come up with a short list of potential NAMAs for a country. So what we'll do now is we'll have another little poll to see where you stand. So the question is, in which sector do you suspect that there was the most opportunity for priority NAMAs in the DR Congo? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that, especially if you're familiar with the region. So I suggest that we look at the result at the end of the presentation, so maybe it will make more sense as I walk you through the methodology and then we can talk about the results at the end. Okay, so the next step was to develop a reference case. So initially it was to do an inventory of the emissions in the country. So this is a picture, if you will, of the GHG emission in the country. Not surprisingly, agriculture is the main cause of GHG emissions. It's interesting to see that energy demand comes second. And I want to point out to you the other interesting is the difference between the energy supply and the energy demand in the country. From there, what we did is we projected these emissions in time using indicators such as the GDP, growth rates, and different indicators. And I apologize, I just noticed that the slide is in French. But if you look at the top one, the one you can barely see is energy supply. Then you move to the darker teal, which is industry. The sort of beige brown color is transport, and then you have waste, and then the teal is energy demand, and then we move to agriculture. So what we found that was really interesting is that if you look at the projection in the future, there will be a lot of emission that we can avoid if we tackle the demand for energy. And again, I point out that this shocking difference between the energy supply and the energy demand in the country. Then we developed, again in the reference case, we looked at the difference between the energy supply and the end consumption of energy. So not surprisingly, biomass is the main source of energy, which is, it's almost the only source of energy that they use over there. And if you look, there's a very low consumption of electricity. So electricity is barely penetrating the country, which in fact explains why biomass is just widely used. So these are the bit of the points that we're able to take out of our reference scenario. There's obviously a shortfall of accessible and affordable energy sources in the country, forcing communities to use non-renewable biomass, which causes a lot of GHG emission. The energy consumption in this DRC is mainly domestic use. There's very low industrial use. The lack of sufficient supply of energy considerably hampers development. And back to what we're saying, that NAMA has to come from priorities of the government and has to be a bottom-up approach, is that we looked at the objective of the government, and as part of they call them the 5 chantiers, which is the 5 priorities in the DRC, which now is the new platform for the government. It's called the Revolution of Modernity, is that access to energy is really the main driver of the development strategy, notably in rural areas. So it's something that we really kept in mind when trying to develop our priority now. We also looked at the main barriers why that electricity production was not penetrating the country. And one of the big factors is that there's no grid. So even if you have a centralized source of energy, such as a hydro dam, where you don't have the infrastructure to actually allow that energy to penetrate the country. And building a grid requires a lot of capital expenditure, which is sometimes hard to get, especially in countries where there's high risks. We also noticed that the communities have a really low purchasing power, so you have to find a source of energy that is relatively cheap and affordable. And there's limited industrial use, so you're really banking on the volume of domestic consumers rather than industry. So from there, and from the discussions we have with the government, we realized that a production of biofuel would be an interesting NAMA to look into for many reasons. First of all, a biofuel could be produced locally, so you don't need a grid to transport the energy. And also because it was part of the development plan of the government to start producing diesel in the country. The DRC is looking at being able to substitute 10% of their actual consumption of diesel fuel with biofuel that would be produced locally. So really we dove into and see if that could be a good potential NAMA. So in order to do so, we had to see if there's the potential for GHG abatement potential. So in this respect, the reduction in emission can come from 2 fronts. From one, the substitution from the biofuel to the diesel fuel, which could lower the emission, and another front, the sequestration from the trees, because we looked into jatropha plantations, which is a tree that produces enough to produce oil, and just the fact that planting those trees could really reduce the emissions. Then we looked at co-benefits. We call them co-benefits. Some people even just call them benefits because they're at the forefront of the NAMA process. So because biofuel often has a bad reputation, and namely on the international scene because it uses palm oil on arable land and the competition with food, we focus our attention again on jatropha because jatropha grows on degraded land and does not compete with food. And since jatropha has a strong taproot, it brings the nutrients back to the soil. So we wanted to make sure that whatever we were proposing was making sure that it was addressing food security. So by doing so, we're able to decide that jatropha was a good way to promote even commercial agriculture with intercropping activities in the jatropha fields. In terms of social benefits, access to electricity obviously brings education, economical spin-off in health. And in terms of environmental benefit, it brings habitat, it prevents desertification, soil improvement, and less pressure on the forest. The jatropha oil could be directly used in cook stove, so there's less use of biomass. And in terms of economics, job creation, it's very labor intensive, and there's secondary economies that can spin off from the access to electricity and the agricultural production. Now the third step was to see, is there a possibility to finance such a project? And so we did a bit of a market analysis and realized that the jatropha oil was a perfect substitute to diesel. So then we can therefore assume that they share the same market, which is about 300 million of liters per year. So now we know there's a market for the product. Based on pilot projects, again, as it was mentioned earlier in the NAMA process, it's really important to bank on what's already existing in the country. So we found pilot projects of jatropha plantations in the country, and we're able to identify that you could produce a liter of oil for 34 cents, including the risk factor, which is well below the price of diesel in rural areas, which varies from $1.50 to $2.40. So that was really interesting. And we also realized that to transform that biofuel into electricity, we could come up with a cost of 16 cents a kilowatt hour compared to 44 cents a kilowatt hour that's costing at the moment using the thermal generators in the rural areas. So, I mean, there is a business case for the use of jatropha oil. And even though there's not a big industrial sector in the DRC, there are still large commercial consumers of diesel. And we identify notably Vodacom, which is the main cell phone provider. So across the country, and it's quite typical of Africa, there's cell towers everywhere, and to each cell tower is associated generator. So by producing the oil locally in region, we can find consumers like that for the oil. There's also the SNEL, which is the main electricity provider, that they still use generators, and the SNCC, the local train or company, and they also use diesel. And both the SNEL and the SNCC are not operating at capacity, full capacity, because of the price of diesel right now. So there's huge potential to finance a project like that. So all the results are available on the Deep Screen report that we did, and it's available. I encourage you to go on the ISD website. It's available in both in French and English, and you can see all the results and all the analysis we did to come up with this priority NAMA in the DRC. Now the lessons learned, I think the main lessons that we want to focus on right now is the importance of the stakeholders. Because as part of the step-by-step methodology to identify NAMA, the first section is a desktop analysis to come up with a quick screen and a list of NAMAs. It's important to know that you always have to validate the information on the ground. The available data does not always reflect reality, so it's important to really go and validate all the findings. And a great example that we found that really changed our focus is that in the DRC, diesel consumption at the pump is factored in the transport emission in the inventory, while in reality, in rural areas, most people go to the pump to fill their generators, because 97% of the electricity needs are met by auto producers, and they go to the pump to fuel their generators. So which means that if you look on paper, NAMA in the transport sector might make sense. In reality, it's really the energy sector that needs to be addressed. The other thing I want to point out is NAMAs are first and foremost about development. You really need to be in coordination with the sustainable development strategies of the country, bank on what's been done already, and it's all about economics and social development perspective, or else you won't get the buy-in of the government, of local communities, and the private sector. So where to go from there? Another point I wanted to mention is often buyers or funders rather are keen on going on the ground and start implementing NAMAs, but what we found notably in the Congo Basin region is that there's still a lot of capacity building work to be done. It's a bit too early to really hit the tarmac and start implementing projects. And I think it's still important to put our resources and energy into capacity building, namely around NAMA institutional frameworks. And I want to underline the importance of climate finance readiness programs so that countries are ready to use these funds and be able to implement NAMA in a more structured way. So maybe now we should go to the result of the poll. So obviously, it's quite interesting that you think that agriculture would be the sector for NAMA, and it's agreed that NAMAs in the industry, in the agriculture sector, would bring a lot of co-benefits and a lot of GHG abatement. Now, we chose energy because it was really a priority from the government, and also because it was easier to gather the stakeholders. And in the scope of the project we had to focus on the stakeholders, and it was easier to narrow down using the sector. But most importantly, I think that it is because it was identified by the government. It is a bottom-up approach. So we went with what the government wanted us to focus on. But I would agree with the participants that there's a lot of potential in agriculture as well. Okay. Basically, that was it for me. But that pretty much resumes the results that we found using the methodology in the DRC. And yeah, that's that.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Marie-Claude, for providing that perspective of the application of the screen. Okay, so just a reminder that you can post questions for the panelists on the right-hand side of your screen there, and we'll address those questions after Deborah's presentation. So Deborah Murphy will be our next speaker. Deborah is an associate with IISD, and she has more than 12 years of experience working on climate change issues. Much of her work focuses on the climate change regime at the international and national and regional levels. Her recent work has involved research, policy analysis, and capacity building on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, agriculture, climate change governance, and more fully exploring the linkages between climate change and other policy frameworks such as clean energy, foreign policy, and international development. Welcome, Deborah, and can I pass it over to you?
Thank you, Melissa, and yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I say good afternoon because I'm sitting here in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'll be talking about the work we did in Kenya on low-carbon development strategies and NAMAs. I apologize in advance if there's some background noise. I'm at actually a workshop on a geothermal NAMA today, and I've sought out a quiet corner in the business center, but it may not always be quiet, so my apologies in advance. I think being in Kenya means there's a bit of a delay with some of the slides, so forgive me in advance if I'm a bit slow in moving them ahead. Anyway, what I'd like to talk about today is the low carbon development pathway that IISD, working with partners, developed for Kenya's climate change action plan. Basically, our team worked to undertake a low carbon assessment that examined greenhouse gas emission trends and sectoral and economy-wide mitigation potential. So using, basically Kenya was almost a test case of our deep screen, where we figured out what the deep screen was, what it meant, how to use it, and through this deep screen process we identified options in the 6 mitigation sectors identified in the UNFCCC: energy, transport, industry, agriculture, forestry, and waste management. And in our analysis we looked at energy from both a supply perspective and a demand perspective. So what I'm going to do, and I'll go through this quite quickly to get to the lessons because it's very similar to what Marie-Claude talked about. I'm just going to look at what we looked at with the deep screen and the steps that we took and some of the key activities that we were undertaken. So as the DRC case, we started with a deep screen selection where we looked at a list of potential NAMAs. And basically in this, in our Kenya work, we were looking at mitigation options out to 2030. And that's consistent with the Kenyan National Development Plan Vision 2030. we looked at, what are the options for NAMAs by looking at various criteria. So, are these opportunities, are these potential NAMAs, are they feasible in the current context? Is their experience, have these types of activities been implemented before? It should have substantive abatement potential, where it's big enough to show up on a wedge of emission reductions in a sector. As noted, we look for alignment with government objectives, and this is something we repeat over and over, that a NAMAs plan and NAMAs must be embedded in national development plans. And of course, we look for positive development impacts. The second stage was developing the reference case. And essentially, I won't go into this, but it's the same as was done in DRC. It's an inventory of historical and forecast emissions. The interesting thing in Kenya was we did it from two perspectives. So the bottom-up spreadsheet process by sector, and then we also did CGE modeling. And I want you to note on the left side of the presentation, you see ongoing stakeholder engagement. Very important part of the process was that we engaged stakeholders continuously in our process. So, for example, in developing the reference case, we tested our assumptions, we tested our growth, how we did our growth forecast, and we took our long list of NAMAs to stakeholders. So at each stage, we consulted very regularly. The third stage was the additional quantitative analysis. We looked, you can see the typical wedge diagram there. We did that by sector. We did that economy-wide. We also developed MAC curves for the various sectors. We calculated abatement costs. Our analysis also looked at such things as possible policy options or programs for moving forward, barriers, feasibility of action. And then, as we noted earlier, very important to assess associated impacts in step 4. So we tried to look at, what are the climate resilience impacts of some of these actions, and that was very important for Kenya because their action plan is based around low carbon climate resilient development. So it was an interesting exercise for us to determine, do these actions or can they be tweaked somehow to have climate resilience benefits? And as you probably expect, these benefits were most noticeable, the climate resilience ones, in the forestry and agriculture sector. You also see the development impacts visualization tool that we used. This tool was actually developed by the LEDS Global Partnership, and the work in Kenya was actually a pilot testing of it. Basically, it gave us a way to visualize the sustainable development impacts in a sector. And so at a glance, you could say, well, this one has more development impacts than this. And we found it was a very useful tool for briefing high-level decision makers who very often have little time, for a detailed analysis. Okay, and yeah, I guess we'll move to another poll and looking at which type of analysis commonly used in prioritizing NAMAs are you most familiar with. So if you could give your answer, abatement costs, wedge analysis, CGE modeling, all of the above or none of the above. Okay, we see that most people have, well, almost half have experience with none of the tools that we've used. So I would suggest that you can take a look at our research reports. It gives you a good overview of those tools. And I do recognize that a lot of the tools are require a certain level of technical expertise, but I see a lot of people have worked on abatement costs, some on wedge analysis, and CGE modeling not so strong. Yeah, I'm looking at the last 3 steps of the deep screen. We did some work on, from the financing perspective for our work, we calculated the investment costs for 5 years, so that's consistent with Kenya's 5-year development planning. We also looked at it out to 2030. And I'll show you another slide in a minute that will show you some of those costs. We developed the report, which included, I should say, had 10 chapters because the methodology is laid out. The reference case is set out, 7 sectors analysis, and the CGE modeling. So, please feel free to access that report on the ISD website. It will link you actually to the Kenya website. and of course validate and finalize the work. And as noted, that ongoing stakeholder engagement, we had sector groups in the 6 sectors which were brought together at various stages in our analysis. And then the government, of course, in doing the action plan, engaged very widely across the country. So there was huge stakeholder input to the entire process. This gives you an idea of some of the analysis we did. I'm not going to go into this in detail. You can certainly access this in our report. But we did identify priority NAMA opportunities based on mitigation potential or abatement potential and sustainable development impacts. As you can see, forestry was very important. And I know Melissa had some questions about NAMAs and REDD, and I'll mention this briefly, but I would suggest that many countries are looking at REDD as being a component of NAMAs. So the two can be linked, and REDD can be included in your NAMA plan. I'll very quickly just go over some of the lessons. I think, as I've said before, the stakeholder engagement is critical. You've got to test your assumptions and your analysis with local experts. This helps to improve your information base because you get data that you didn't know perhaps was accessible, and it helps to build a broader understanding of how to transition to a low-carbon economy. And I think it helps, really importantly, to ensure that the process and the results are locally owned. While we were consultants from the outside doing an analysis, I think what was very encouraging in our situation was that, all of our partners can now speak to this, and really it shouldn't be me here talking about it. It should be someone, someone from the Kenya government who owns the action plan. And other lessons, this has been stated before too, so I don't need to go into this, but national development plans need to be the starting point. Also, that high-level buy-in is needed and absolutely essential. It gives momentum to the process, and it will help you, your senior-level champions can ensure you get the political buy-in. Note that if you undertake this exercise, the prioritization is not easy. It's often political. And note that all of these tools, they're planning tools, and they need to be revisited. In Kenya's case, they plan to revisit it every 5 years on a timeline that's consistent with their national planning process. So thank you very much. I was very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about our work, and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deborah. And a sincere thank you to all of our speakers. We'll now take questions from the audience, and I invite Dave to chair this part of the webinar.
Great, thank you, Melissa. That was excellent, both MC and Deborah, giving us a nice sort of a hands-on overview of how the NAMA development process moves forward in countries. A couple of housekeeping points. There have been a number of questions about how to access the webinar after the event. If you look at your questions box, there's some URLs posted there. So we will be putting up the deck from today as well as a recording of the webinar for you to enjoy at a later date. So now we'll move on to the questions. A number of questions have been posted to us. So the first question here, we received this question. As NAMAs require evidence of similar action in the country, how do they address new initiatives and new technologies in that country? So when we were looking at the more comprehensive Kenya case, and I'll defer to Deb in a second, Deborah, the more comprehensive case in Kenya, we were looking for quick wins, quick NAMA wins that could scale up existing initiatives that already had, there were already a going concern in the country. They had links into government. They reflected priorities. They had financial accounts, and there was the sense that you could then sort of catalyze those and roll them out, scale them up nationally through additional climate finance. So that was how the quick sort of, that was sort of the one way to scale up really quick. The other way was to identify these newer, longer-term visions that, looked more like large-scale urban transportation projects, for example, that really were sort of long-term development aspirations. And what we started to do is to look at the national planning process in Kenya, MTP2, basically looking out over the next 5 years and then even longer than that, and what do the investment flows look like to scale up or roll out, not to scale up, to roll out some of these new initiatives. So it depends whether you want these quick wins or whether you want this sort of quick win and this holistic longer-term view of NAMA's deployment. You can basically accommodate both in the NAMA process. And Marie-Claude, do you have any thoughts there?
No, I agree with what you said.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the next question, someone is starting to work on a NAMA country office later this year and wondering what the time frame for these screens usually is. How long would we need to plan for which step? So it's an interesting question that builds on the last one. The quick screen exercise can really be completed in a matter of weeks. You know, the methodology really focuses on existing government documentation. So basically you collect as much information as you can. You work with existing stakeholders to sort of figure out, you know, where the documentation is. You sort it, you put it through the process, and you come up with a document for validation. Then the validation and prioritization then takes longer. So the analytics take weeks, and the process maybe takes months to get some buy-in and get people interested in the results and start to think about prioritization. The deep screen you can think of as being months of analysis. So here we're collecting much more detailed information on emission inventories and forecasts, and we're really spending a lot of time collecting information to build up both the emission inventory, but also, you know, a series of good co-benefits associated with those abatement opportunities and the climate resilient opportunities of those choices. And you're collecting costs, you know, cost information. So it takes quite a while. And then even once you have that, you're going to have a process of education within government that has to happen around, okay, here's our list of priorities that have been identified, here are the analytics that are rolling out, and here are the choices that are being revealed, the implications of rolling out those opportunities. So that, you know, so that process takes time, and then financing and implementation obviously take a fair amount of time. So again, you can think of quick wins where you scale up existing initiatives, look for quick wins to demonstrate success and roll forward, attract climate finance to existing opportunities, and then take a longer-term view to roll out perhaps new NAMAs and new initiatives that would take probably 2 years when you think about it, you know, in an expedient fashion. It'd probably take 2 years before you actually secured funding and got rolling on them given the project life cycle. So you have to think quick wins to demonstrate progress and then move forward. MC, do you have any thoughts?
Well, just based on our experience, that's exactly what you said. The quick screen took a few weeks. And then the deep screen, we were able to do that in a scope of a few months, maybe a bit more, 4 or 5 months. And then I agree with you, Dave, that once you go on the implementation and financing, we're looking at years. 1 to 2 years is even more, to be conservative. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. It's a country-specific question. We are not on this question of Bangladesh. Right now, we're seeking additional funding to continue to do new countries. But we're also, I mean, the reason we've put out the practitioner's guide and the e-learning course is to, you know, to enable others to roll forward. So I would suggest if Bangladesh is interested, that, you know, they could start with the deep screen and start to think about themselves what, you know, how to push forward on that. Next question, question 4, please.
Okay, I guess this one's addressed to me. Who identified the co-benefits for the Jatropha NAMA in the Congo? As I mentioned throughout the presentation, it was really stakeholder driven, so we have analysts that looked into this, but really it was a work of addressing it with all the stakeholders, and I'm talking about from the chiefs in villages all the way to people in ministries and high-level government authorities, so really the whole hue of every stakeholder was involved. I mean, it was really a quick identification of those co-benefits. There's still a lot of work to find indicators and to track them out.
Thank you. The next question, this is a really interesting question about readiness. So the most one can hope from a quick screen exercise done by a bunch of international consultants and local consultants, because we worked quite in all the countries, we worked very closely with our local counterparts. One can't expect much to come out of that other than starting the process rolling forward. And what we've noticed is that with NAMAs, unlike say a CDM project that's very very focused and very technical and can be accomplished by a small technical team. NAMAs are a different thing entirely. They're typically economy-wide or sector-wide, and they require, you know, two things as we've talked about: process and analytics. And so really we think the readiness around government, around process, around development, around technical aspects of NAMA development are absolutely central. So we would encourage donors to start putting more money into NAMA readiness and country capacity building. Looking at the time, I think we're going to stop the questions there, unless MC, do you have one last thought on that institutional arrangement question?
No, I absolutely agree with what you said.
Great. So we're sorry we couldn't get to more questions given the time. Our time's up and we respect the time. We will be, however, answering the questions through text and posting them online and sending them out for others to see, along with the course and the recording of today's webinar. Melissa, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave. Thanks to all of our speakers for addressing those questions. So I'd also like to remind everyone that the next webinar in the series, Developing Financeable NAMAs, will take place on July 16th, and we'll be looking at preparing a GHG emissions baseline projection, which is a crucial part of this process. So you can click there to register, and you can also find registration for the online courses there, and the GHG course will be available for the pilot process for enrollment beginning today. So with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thanks again to our speakers and to our technical team, Leslie Paz and Pauline Girard, and to you, the audience, for your participation, and I hope that you can join us next week.